Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning into today's show on this rainy Wednesday afternoon here on December 11th. We have a great midweek show to get you out of those rainy doldrums if you live here on the East Coast. Starting off with a Thursday night football game that I'll be watching with bated breath. Rams 49ers, going over some betting odds there and some prop bets that might hit for you. Continuing our positional rankings with my tight end position. Still a lot of interesting players that can help you get over the finish line in your fantasy playoffs. Then we're looking at the Offensive Rookie of the Year race. Very interesting race. Thought it was going to be a one-horse race for large portions of this season. Now it seemingly is wide open. And then, as always, concluding with potentially my final weekly shadow report of the regular season, talking about some key wide receiver cornerback matchups that will be important in the fantasy playoffs this weekend. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, if you want more content such as this, including exclusive short content to view before the show, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network. But not just my show as well, there are a lot of other great shows around the GSMC Sports Network and Podcast Network. Great people doing great things. That's greatly appreciated in advance, should you choose to follow them as well. But if you want to interact with our shows a little bit more directly as well, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions on air. You can do it through our website, gsmcspodcast.net. You can leave a tip, a donation, and a comment, question, or concern you might have throughout the show there, or you can do it through YouTube through these many features here. It just makes the show that much better and is greatly appreciated by all concerned, no matter what show you are tuning into. So without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day, starting off with that Thursday night football game tomorrow in the NFC West. Like I said, one, as a Seattle fan, I'll be watching very, very closely. The Rams taking on the 49ers in this one. Now, here's the situation in the NFC West. The Rams, seemingly the hottest team in that division on the offensive side of the football, because of the fact that now that Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua are both back healthy, they're firing on all cylinders. It's really going to come down to Matthew Stafford at his age. Can he contain this consistency on the offensive side of the football after what we saw from him in Buffalo? Or will he revert back to his kind of aging self that we've seen throughout the season, where the Rams look good one day and then get inconsistent the next? And then on the 49ers side of the thing, here's a team, right, that's seemingly mathematically out of the playoff picture right now. They don't have many tiebreakers in the NFC West, which is the only thing that can really save them should they win the division. But in terms of their season, they're more depleted. They look a little bit more decimated, and they look a little bit more lackluster in many different areas. Not as efficient scoring-wise as they were last season, and that stems down to a lot of things, right? Not having certain players in certain positions, losing people for the season, much like McCaffrey and Ayuk these past couple of weeks. And now they sit in a bizarre place where this game might not mean much for their season, right? Even though if they win, they'll get back to 500 and they'll technically still be in the NFC West picture. But they could play spoiler at home to a Rams team that certainly feels like, right now, a team not many people want to face, but still has to prove it. Because here's the thing. The Rams perhaps had the easiest schedule, besides the Cardinals, remaining amongst these NFC West playoff hopefuls and division title hopefuls for that matter. The Seahawks still have to play two of the best teams in the NFC North, the Packers and Vikings, back-to-back weeks. They play the Bears, which is perhaps the most winnable game over the remaining stretch. And then the Rams, a potential game for the title in that final week of the season. So this game really is the litmus test for the Los Angeles Rams. They want to build on that offensive performance and maintain this consistency that they've been missing throughout this season, much like they've been missing dearly their top two receivers. And when those top two receivers are on their game, we know what this Rams team can be. On the other side of things, the 49ers, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it. They're still a fantastic team without certain weapons. It's just that they don't necessarily have enough to compensate for the losses of some important guys. Brandon Ayuk's a very important loss, and a lot of people last season might not have said that because Brandon Ayuk seemingly, even though in a contract year, kind of fell a little bit down the pecking order at times, but then in the playoffs really made a name for himself. Now that he's out for the season, it's going to be up to guys like Debo to step up, Jawan Jennings, who's had a very nice year this year, George Kittle, ultimately to help Brock Purdy, who has had a down year here. On the defensive side of the football, though, this is a team that seemingly looks lackluster ever since, or has looked lackluster ever since Nick Bosa went down in that Seattle game a couple of weeks ago. And now, looking at it from that perspective, they really need to find different ways to try and get the most out of this relatively young defense here. I mean, you have good pieces, right? You have Drake Greenlaw still. You have good secondary pieces when healthy in Hufanga and Charvarius Ward. But there's really no one that's a difference maker like Nick Bosa in this squad right now. And Fred Warner as well, you know, he can, when he's on the field, be a difference maker, but relatively of late has not been on the field. So the 49ers are in a very sticky situation here. However, in this matchup, according to Vegas, they are still the favorites. The home favorites in this one. 2 points, over under 48.5. So as you can see, they're expecting a pretty testy game, despite the fact that the 49ers are decimated. And then, in terms of money lines, San Fran minus 130. The Los Angeles Rams are plus 110. In terms of who and how they win this game, for the Rams, it's going to be about fixing some defensive issues they came up against Buffalo. They still allowed 42 points in that game. They allowed Josh Allen to run roughshod over them. Now you have a lot of talent, young talent at that, in your defense this year. Jared Verse leading all rookies in terms of sacks and QB pressures. Braden Fisk doing his thing. Cameron Kinchin with a couple interceptions in the secondary this season. So we know the talent is there on the Rams defensive side of the football. Now it's just about playing clean football down the stretch to complement what this offense can be. For the 49ers, it's more about, trying to get back to the efficiency they found in the red zone a year ago. Because last year they were perhaps one of the best red zone teams in the league in terms of efficiency. This year, they're towards the bottom. And I really know that Christian McCaffrey is a huge part of their red zone offense. Without him, it's kind of difficult to truly scheme up different matchups in the passing game to try and confuse defense, because Christian McCaffrey is the ultimate confuser when we talk about red zone efficiency. But I do believe that this game will be down to guys like Jawan Jennings and Debo Samuel utilizing their best traits to really help out Brock Purdy. Debo Samuel is going to try to extend the field as much as possible, not usually being his route running self in terms of trying to create yards after the catch. He's really going to try and get vertical, I believe, in this one. Whereas Jawan Jennings is going to be the more tactical of the two, exploit soft coverages, get a lot of underneath yardage, potentially open up some things for George Kittle once they get to the red zone, who's the big physical threat there. We'll talk about him and his impact on this game in the next segment. But in order to do that, I feel like Brock Purdy has to be the X factor as well, because this defensive front, no matter what happened to them against Buffalo, could still get to the quarterback. And this offensive line has been a little bit shaky. There have been bright spots. Rookie Dominic Pooney stepping in the guard position, really filling in well. But you have guys like McKivitz getting oft penalized. You have Trent Williams consistently being injury prone. Other issues along that offensive line that need to be tailored and fixed. But ultimately, it's all down to Brock Purdy and his decision-making in this matchup. Because, yes, you can blame the offensive line, but Purdy needs to play within himself the way we know how to really suppress all the doubters in terms of this quote-unquote system quarterback talk. Because right now, it's proving to be difficult without certain pieces in this offense for Brock Purdy. And for the Rams, I feel like you have the ability to put up enough points on this defense where it's comfortable. I feel like this offense is really capable of anything right now. Kupp and Nakua look primed to drag this Rams team into the postseason by hook or by crook. And it's all going to depend on, their quarterback as well for different reasons. Matthew Stafford. Can he throw it back to his younger years and really help this team remain consistent in terms of quarterback play? Because you really have special talent in your skill position core, especially with your wide receivers. But it's going to come down to how Matthew Stafford plays. We know Matthew Stafford, when he's firing on all cylinders, one of the smartest, most intelligent quarterbacks in the National Football League, and one of the most accurate as well. But it's all going to come down to age factoring in, because this year he has shown that he might be susceptible to inconsistencies in his game due to his age. And so, even though this Rams team right now looks like it's playing with house money, there's still not a team that I feel comfortable with proclaiming NFC West champions just yet. They had the schedule to back that claim up that they definitely could become NFC West champions because Seattle has a tougher stretch. But I do still think that until they put it all together on the football field, this team, I can't necessarily see winning this division. And the 49ers are still a team that can play spoiler in that regard. They're still a team that has the talent, that has the potential to truly makes a mess of the NFC West picture. And if so, then that Seattle-Los Angeles game in the last week of the season will become ever more important in telling us who's the true champion of the NFC West. And I might want it to be that way as a Seattle Seahawks fan, because if the Rams win this game, then it becomes a lot more tougher for Seattle down the stretch. They have to be very consistent. They might just have to win one or both of those NFC North gauntlet games, as I call them. So we're going to have to see how the NFC West plays out, and this game will be a telling factor in how it does. But let me know what you think about it in the comments, because upcoming on this show, we're going to be talking about some player props that you might want to look out for. Who will have a huge impact in this one? Tune in to find out in the second segment of today's show, right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you feel so inclined throughout the show's duration, if you wish to contribute and interact with it a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube or at our website, gsmcspodcast.net, where you can leave a tip or donation as well. But through YouTube, these features really help you contribute, interact with the show, get your opinions on air. Just makes this show that much better. But without further ado, let's jump into our second segment, still remaining in the realm of Thursday Night Football and that very, very important matchup over there in the NFC West, Rams 49ers. And a lot of players can do a lot of good for their teams in this one. We still have really deciding factors on both sides of the football in this one in terms of who can get going and who's going to be vital in terms of pulling out the win for their respective teams. And it's translating onto these prop bets, because I do feel like the betting market is kind to both of these teams, because looking at both of these teams, it's clear to see who are going to be the standout options when you're betting on this matchup. Starting off with one that I feel can be a hit for you, because this guy is going to want to set the tone for LA from the get-go. I'm talking about Puka Nacua potentially being the first touchdown scorer in this match. Plus 900, it is kind of a lofty bet still. But the reason why I think Puka Nacua can set the tone early in this game for the Rams, should they get the football first, is because he's going to want to occupy unusual spaces for someone who really has an undefined position in McVay's offense. He moves around a lot in their alignments. He's not necessarily a slot receiver, but he can be dominant over the middle of the field because of a spectacular 50-50 catcher of the football. Then on the perimeter, he just gets more open than most Rams receivers in that position. Not to say that Cooper Kupp can't, because he's a spectacular out route runner as well. I'm looking at Puka and how he aligns along the football field in this offense. He just moves around so much that I feel that if the Rams get the football first, they're going to want to set the tone with him, because he's the more difficult, I believe, of the two in terms of deciding how to defend him. And this 49ers secondary, I really don't know what its identity is right now, because they have a lot of players still banged up, and they really don't have a set lineup of corners and safeties to truly kind of attack this Rams front. It's all going to have to come from that front seven, generating pressure on Stafford, because if not, then Puka can get going and he may score more than one touchdown in this matchup. And then the 49ers side of things, when I think about important players in this matchup, vital players in terms of trying to pull off this upset win, well, technically not an upset even though they are favored, but in my mind, it will be an upset of sorts. How about George Kittle? Let's talk about him and his importance to this football team. Out of all different tight ends in the National Football League, I don't think you can find a bigger, more physical threat in all aspects of what a tight end needs to do than George Kittle. But this season, for some reason, while he has had impactful moments, I feel like the 49ers are shying away from truly bringing him into football games. And he's going to have to do it in this one to try and spoil the Rams' fun, because George Kittle, out of anyone who can fix the 49ers' red zone woes, it's him. And I feel the way you do that is get different receivers moving. Say, for example, Jawan Jennings on late downs, Deebo Samuel on early downs, to really stretch the field. Once you get into the red zone, use the physicality of George Kittle to really try and pound it into the end zone. Because George Kittle is someone who can bring the physicality of someone like a Josh Allen, who can really occupy the Rams' defense in their secondary, enough to really make it seem as if they're scheming for him, when in fact it's more about Deebo Samuel, and Jawan Jennings for that matter, getting him into good spaces where his name can be heard, scoring touchdowns more. So I'm going to say he's an anytime touchdown scorer at plus 160, just because when they get to the red zone, he's going to be the main man for them in that area of the field. Let's talk about these two quarterbacks as well, because both of them could either help or hurt their team, like we talked about. Brock Purdy, in a sense, can help his team by just remaining his calm, composed, and poised self, but he can also hinder his team because of the fact that he might be too reliant on certain players in certain situations, leading to more tentative play in certain areas of the field. Whereas Matthew Stafford, we already know, his inconsistency, potentially due to his age, can lead to certain errors in his game, and that's the reason why the Rams are fighting for their playoff lives rather than, firmly cementing themselves as an NFC contender. But in this game, looking at both of these guys and looking at both of these defenses, I think both of them are apt to hit the overs. Brock Purdy over 243 and Matthew Stafford over 257.5, because both of these defenses, in my mind, seem to have lost their luster. For the Rams, their big thing early on or in the middle of the season to get to this point was relying more on the pressure that both Verse and Fisk could create up front. And then the emergence of Cameron Kinchins in the back end really helped them as well. As for the 49ers, they're reliant too much on Nick Bosa generating pressure. And once he went down, you saw what the lack of a dominant pass rusher did to this defense that's still relatively young, mind you, in certain areas of the field, and still don't have a lot of the pieces that got them to that level last year to the Super Bowl. Dre Greenlaw had injury issues. Fred Warner has had injury issues. Both your young secondary players, Ward and Hufanga, have had injury issues as well. So they haven't really had consistency enough in their defense to really help them. So, in terms of both of these struggling defenses, look for these quarterbacks to want to play as efficiently as possible. Because I think the difference in this game could be, like what the Rams did to Buffalo, a couple special teams or a couple defensive plays that turn the game in your favor. So that's why I feel like both of these quarterbacks are going to want to key in, follow their game plans early, and most importantly, protect the football. Because while both of these defenses have their issues, they're primed to take advantage of you when you let your guard down, especially the Rams defense. So Purdy especially is kind of more of a long shot in that mind, because he might push himself a little too much, might force the issue a little too much. Whereas Matthew Stafford can rely on a lot more reliable receivers. But I think that both of these defenses can get got in this one, and both of these quarterbacks are competent enough to do it. So look for both of them potentially to hit their over totals in this one as well. And then last but not least, let's talk about a running back in this one who has kind of been a spotty starter at the position, whether it be in real life or fantasy as well. A lot of contention surrounding this player. How about Kyren Williams in this matchup? When I think of Kyren Williams, I think of someone who has relatively kept the pace he set for himself in his first year as a starter in that Rams offense last year to now. Because he had a stretch of games where he scored a touchdown in 10 straight. And he's proven that he can consistently be the chunk play guy that can get an offense going. He can really open things up for both Kupp and Nakua in this offense. And he's really a nice complement to what they want to do in that offense. But I do think in this particular matchup, he's going to hit the under just because I feel like this Rams passing attack is too dominant to ignore. And I feel like what McVay is going to do in this game is going to set up nice matches using motion to really open up what Matthew Stafford can do underneath. Because that's where I feel Sean McVay realizes Matthew Stafford is most comfortable right now. Because Matthew Stafford, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, is still a fantastic short to intermediate route thrower of the football. And I do feel like the way you can exploit this young linebacker core and secondary core is with underneath routes that allow Kupp and Nakua to do what they do best and gain yards after the catch. So, in that sense, I feel like Kyren Williams might take a back seat in order to really allow Kupp and Nakua to have a say in this game. Not for nothing, I do feel like in terms of the receiving game, he could be impactful because they might want to use a couple screens to get going. And down in the red zone, he really is a huge threat when they get into short yardage situations. So, look for Kyren Williams to still make an impact in this game, and not so much on the rushing end of things. So I'm going to say he hits the under in this matchup as well. But think about this. You have two teams, and this is outside of talking about just individual players here. You have two teams, the same division, with this much talent on both sides of the football, with two kind of similar styles, two very similarly minded head coaches, at least on the offensive side of the football, who really want to pressure you in terms of using different weapons to get open. It's just a matter of, right, who they rely upon in bigger moments, right? Because what we've seen from the Niners, right, is inconsistency in the red zone, which spells danger for my George Kittle prediction. But I still think that George Kittle, if anything, is their best red zone threat. You see what I'm saying here? You have to follow a certain logic to really decipher how these teams will attack each other. I feel like Puka Nacua, should the Rams get the football first, can set a tone because of his route running abilities. But in terms of play style early in this game, Kyren Williams might take a backseat. So in a matchup, we have so much talent to choose from when you're a perspective better. You have to realize how these teams play, especially more offensive-minded teams with two head coaches who can utilize so many different players to the best of their abilities. So that's why I feel like this game might get a little bit hairy as a bettor, and I advise you to think carefully about certain areas of what these teams do and how efficiency could play into this. But I do think this is a fun matchup in the NFC West that I'm going to be watching very passionately as a Seattle fan. Let me know what you think about this one in the comments below, because coming up next, we continue with our positional rankings with the tight end position. This position is going to be very thrilling to watch in a fantasy playoff setting. So coming up next, we'll talk about them right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of today's show, let's continue with our positional rankings for the first week of the fantasy playoffs with the tight end position. Now, this is a position that I always respect as one that is so volatile in nature, so talented from top to bottom, that you can really choose and analyze any player you want from a fantasy setting, but in the playoffs, perhaps is the most exciting position just because of its depth. So I feel like this ranking could have been much more diverse and much more deep in terms of who I could have picked, but I do feel like if you want dominance, if you want a player who can be a difference maker at the tight end position, someone who some others might not even think about, these are four guys who I feel like these next couple of weeks of the season really will stand out with their respective teams. And I'm not saying that they're immediate tight end ones in your fantasy roster for the playoffs, but I do feel like a couple of them could be flex options if you're not necessarily comfortable with any of them. But at the end of the day, I do feel like when all is said and done, these four could be very competent tight end ones on their day if you give them the chance. Without further ado, let's talk about them, whether or not you're really thinking about these guys for your fantasy playoff roster. Starting off with the guy who I really think is a little bit frustrated right now, but can get going at any time, and I feel in this easier slate of games in the stretch for him, he will. How about Trey McBride going against the Pats? Still had 14 fantasy points against Seattle this past weekend, but ultimately still not finding the end zone. A frustrating stretch of form for him in that regard, but he's still an excellent catcher of the football. It's just a matter of, tough matchups against tough opposing defenses. But the Pats, I feel like they're going to key in a little bit too much on Marvin Harrison Jr., be too focused on that matchup to really care about watching the big man in the middle, Trey McBride. And he's going to get a lot of easy receptions, opportunities for yards after the catch, and thus will have a much better game, potentially find the end zone in this one. Because I do feel like the frustration also stems from Kyler Murray's play as well, where a lot more pressure is being put upon him, and as a result, he hasn't necessarily looked as comfortable in these last couple of games as we thought he was to start the season. So it's going to be more about remaining efficient, taking what the defense gives you, and thus a lot more of Murray to McBride in this one than we've seen in recent weeks. So look for Trey McBride to try and develop into this game, and if the Patriots play him more soft than you would think, look for him to have a big game again, and look for him to potentially be next year a guy you want again and again and again, week after week, to rely upon. Let's talk about another guy who a lot of people have liked through the years in fantasy football circles. Maybe not so much this year, as he has found a new home still in the NFC East, but in a offense that really, I don't necessarily know is too tailored for him, but still could use him in certain situations. And especially if they try to wrap up a postseason place down the stretch, they might want to utilize him more than ever because of his physicality and because of his experience. How about Zach Ertz? After the bye, the Washington Commanders have a pretty easy stretch of games, the last wildcard spot, and depending on how the NFC West pans out, they could wrap up the last wildcard spot should they consistently win games. They could go 3-1 and wrap it up comfortably. But when I look at the issues that we saw with this team over that kind of difficult stretch they had, when they played the Eagles and the Cowboys and had some bizarre losses there, I feel like they didn't necessarily rely too much on the physicality of their weapons. I feel like Jalen Daniels and his rapport with those downfield guys like Terry McLaurin, like a De'Ami Brown sometimes, like a Noah Brown sometimes, really has hindered what he could do underneath. Not to say that he's losing efficiency, because he's still an efficient passer with the football, but I feel like his best moments have come from taking the short routes. And I know he's more comfortable, right? Creating out of structure, creating downfield most importantly. But Zach Ertz has been one of the most consistent short yardage tight ends in football in that regard. And I know they're trying to incorporate a lot more young tight ends. I know that they have Ben Sinnott, Luke McCaffrey in their ranks. Well, Luke McCaffrey's more of a wide receiver tight end hybrid. As John S. in the chat, are the Yankees in on Bregman? I'm sorry, my big man. I am not necessarily talking about baseball at the moment. Potentially in the future we will get more into baseball in the show, and I can't really tell you if the Yankees can or should be in on Bregman, but I do appreciate the question. That being said, as a Rangers fan, I hope he leaves that division. He's been a torturer of that division for far too long, so I'll be glad if the Yankees pick him up, even if it bolsters their squad, the Evil Empire. Hopefully that helps, even though we are a fantasy quote-unquote football show for the time being. But thank you for your questions. Hope you enjoy the show, my man. But in terms of Zach Ertz, I think that down the stretch, we're going to start to see Jalen Daniels rely on him a bit more, and as a result, be a competent enough fantasy football prospect to really have to consider starting him week in, week out down the stretch in the playoffs. Then Mark Andrews is another guy who I feel like has been underutilized this season, and I feel like it's not necessarily his fault. It's more of the circumstances of this offense, right? The Ravens, as I see it, are very similar to the Eagles in that they're a very ball control heavy offense. They still rely a lot on Lamar Jackson's downfield abilities in the pass game, and we've seen it in the past couple of weeks with long throws to both Bateman and Flowers. But Mark Andrews, I still feel like, is the X factor here, because he is a brilliant route runner. He not necessarily is the fastest of players, but once he gets an open space, you can't catch him. And he's the biggest red zone threat, in my opinion, out of any tight end. And I feel like down the stretch for the Ravens, trying to get back to what they do best coming off this bye, Mark Andrews is going to be a huge part of that. He can really settle down this offense and really, most importantly, maintain his rapport with Lamar Jackson in crucial moments. And that's something that I really want to see Baltimore do, not just in these last couple of games of the regular season, but also in the postseason as well. Maybe you're not going to focus as much from a fantasy perspective on the NFL postseason, but I really want people to understand what Mark Andrews' importance is in this roster, even when he's not having impacts on games. I feel like the Ravens as a team are lesser than a lot of these AFC contenders when Mark Andrews isn't either A, catching passes, or B, occupying space underneath to open up things downfield. He's a huge part of what Lamar Jackson is able to do downfield because of the spaces he occupies. And so, if he doesn't necessarily do that down the stretch, then I do feel like the Ravens could be a surprise first-round exit in this very tough AFC field. They have another game against the Steelers, a defense known for sucking the life out of you and sucking the life out of Lamar Jackson especially. Only one win against them his entire career. So Mark Andrews really is going to be all hands on deck these next couple of weeks, so to speak. And especially in the postseason, when you're going to need a physical tight end underneath to alleviate the burden on your quarterback, when all these defenses are going to want to send pressure in the AFC field especially. So Mark Andrews is going to be someone who I feel can be effective in the regular season, but also pretty vital in terms of what you might think of his long-term future as a fantasy prospect in the postseason. And then the last player that I'm going to talk about in this tight end ranking is a guy who I kind of feel like goes too often under the radar, mainly because of his team, mainly because he's kind of lost his luster in this offense, not a top target anymore, but still a very timely, opportunistic player who on any given Sunday can potentially be a tight end one. And I feel like this offense has enough juice in it, has enough excitement in it, has enough plays in it to allow this guy to get going down the stretch. This is a tough matchup here for his team, especially considering the fact that their spoiler role kind of got spoiled this past week when they tried to upset the Steelers for the second straight week. But David Njoku, let's talk about him in the landscape of tight ends as well, because I feel like David Njoku is the perfect middle ground for the position, because you have all the superstars, young and old. But then, in this middle ground of tight ends, you really have very few separations between certain players. But David Njoku certainly feels like perfect mid-tier tight end, because you can feel he's primed to break into the upper echelon of tight ends in fantasy perspective, but because of the inconsistencies of his team and his roster, really hasn't gotten the chance to. And over these past couple of weeks, yes, he's played very well. 17.2 fantasy points against Pittsburgh. Very, very timely player when given the chance. Very, very solid all-around tight end. But the question is he consistent enough to warrant true consideration as your starting tight end or potentially a flex player? I think the answer is tentatively yes, but because of the volatility of this Browns offense now, and for as long as Deshaun Watson remains on that roster, I think that David Njoku is going to be hard done by more often than not. But in this match with the Chiefs, I feel like if the Browns want to make this a contest, David Njoku is going to play a big role, because the Chiefs' front seven are going to want to wreak havoc. But I do feel like if Jameis is comfortable in the short to intermediate areas of the field, then I do feel like they can move the chains, retain the football enough, keep Patrick Mahomes off the field, and most importantly, get David Njoku going. And if David Njoku gets going, it wears down this physical Chiefs defense. And so that's why I feel David Njoku in this matchup could be special for you. I'm not necessarily saying this is a lock to start for you the entirety of the fantasy postseason. But if you have him in your roster, why not throw him out there? Because he is someone who has that ability to be the tight end one for you, to be very special in fantasy week in, week out. But it's all up to what this offense looks like, because we've seen what it can look like at its apex with Jameis. We've seen the nadirs. We've seen the pick sixes. We've seen the inconsistencies in his decision making. But if he can get it right enough so that David Njoku has the amount of targets he needs to put up good numbers, the chances are David Njoku can play like a star from a fantasy standpoint. Let me know what you think about my potentially final tight end rankings here for this week, first week of the fantasy playoffs. Because coming up next, we transition into the world of odds, continuing with our look-intos for certain awards this NFL season with the Offensive Rookie of the Year race heating up. It's definitely an exciting one to follow. We'll be right back to talk about it right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of the day, we're going to continue with our NFL awards updates. We are getting to the conclusion of the regular season, and thus we might have to start looking more into NFL awards and who we might think wins. And this race here for the Offensive Rookie of the Year might be the most exciting, because we all thought at the start of the season to the middle point that one player was running away with it, and his name was Jaden Daniels. But over these past couple of weeks, as he hit a rough patch, and Bo Nix and that Sean Payton offense started to get going, started to bring out his best abilities and traits for this Broncos team, it started to become a one-horse race. And then Brock Bowers throws his hat into the ring with a couple of stretches of good performances that we've won out of him as a solid tight end, perhaps the future of that position for Las Vegas. And still a lot of other players going under the radar in this race as well. But I do feel like those two guys are separating themselves, but I still want to acknowledge this rookie class for what it is. A very talented group I'm excited to see mature in this NFL. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the updated Offensive Rookie of the Year. Starting at the number 5 spot, a player who unfortunately has been a little bit too inconsistent to make a name for himself in this race, but I feel like could be a very special player on the stretch if this team gets its head straight in terms of getting new ownership, potentially getting a new head coach who can truly develop a guy like him and truly utilize him to the best of his abilities, and that is Brian Thomas Jr. Now let's be clear. This year's iteration of the Jacksonville Jaguars was not helpful in terms of developing and helping Brian Thomas Jr. mature. And that's why he sits at number 5 at plus 15,000 odds in this award race, when he could have potentially been one of the top contenders for this award. The reason being is that I don't necessarily think Doug Peterson is the proper coach to help him get to the points that he wants to go. But when I look at this team and I look at its long-term future, and the decision they made to tie down Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence is one of the best deep ball throwers in the NFL. If they get a coach who can unlock that in him and can get this Lawrence-Thomas connection going, then this is a very special partnership we're looking at over the next 5 to 10 years in the NFL. And while he's definitely not going to be in the running for the Offensive Rookie of the Year award, that does not mean that his career will not skyrocket in years to come should the Jaguars get this head coaching position right. Because if they do, then Brian Thomas Jr. is going to be a very special talent to worry about in the league as the Jaguars get better and better. So, for now, he sits outside of the running for this award. But in the future, he'll be a very, very special receiver for Jacksonville in their rebuild. In the number 4 position, a guy who has been a little bit too inconsistent as well, the number 1 overall draft pick, Caleb Williams. He's had a really rough season. Not what you would expect out of a number 1 overall draft pick. But there have been a lot of bright spots, especially when in the midpoint of the season they decided to fire Shane Waldron and bring in offensive coordinator Thomas Brown, who was the interim head coach. And even in his first game as a first-time head coach, he kind of screwed the pooch with that one. In the time before his interim status, he really brought out the best in Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams' best moments have come when he's operating outside of structure, and it's come as a scrambler and finding his players downfield. And when he moves in the pocket, I feel like he can become something much more close to what we saw from him out of USC. But also, the offensive line issues abound. The sacks abound. he is the most sacked quarterback in the NFL. And that's the reason why at plus 6,000 he sits at number 4 and not challenging the other 2 rookie quarterbacks in this race. He still is a special player. He still has the raw potential needed to truly elevate the Chicago Bears team into contender status in the future. But if they don't fix the offensive line, if the new head coach kind of wants him to play a little bit more like Bo Nix perhaps, where he's a little bit more structured in play, then chances are his career won't take off like we expect it will. But if they get the head coaching position right, this offensive line's issues get fixed and adjusted, then Caleb Williams could be up and running in his NFL season next year. Because I do think he's still going to be a special player for this Bears franchise, and I do think he can be, finally, their first franchise quarterback. And then at number 3, this is a guy who came on a little bit too late, but to even be at number 3 in this rankings from where he was and where his team was, for that matter, is really special. And at a tight end position. It's very special to think about. Brock Bowers. A lot of people believe this guy is the future of the position, and I'm of that belief too. But the Raiders have to nail this 2025 NFL draft. They have to either get Shador or Cam Ward, try and build hype in this team again, and then allow Brock Bowers to be Brock Bowers, because there's truly no tight end quite like them. He plays like a wide receiver. There's no other way to describe the way he plays. This is a guy who is big, physical, but is faster than your prototypical tight end, can block as well, and ultimately perhaps is their best target out of any of their weapons. Jacoby Myers might be a special player if, he can get going with their next QB, but I feel like Brock Bowers is the guy to key in on in this rebuild for Las Vegas. And if it's Antonio Pierce, this is a guy who you really like as a physical head coach that you have to want to bolster in your squad. But if it's someone else, potentially Dion, you have to realize that your son might not be the star should he follow you to Las Vegas. This is the star of this team. And I feel like these past couple of games are the reason why he's at number 3 at plus 1,200 at this position. But I do feel like the inconsistencies in his season would keep him from challenging these top 2 guys. And also because of the fact, the tight end position has never been as pretty of a choice as a quarterback or a young rookie quarterback lining it up, much like CJ Stroud did last year, much like what these next 2 guys have been doing over these past couple of weeks. So, as much as I would love to say Brock Bowers could be the top contender for this award, he's doing very special things to the position, and I wish him the best in his NFL career, and I hope that the Las Vegas Raiders can be contenders for him. Right now, at this point in his career, his rookie year, it's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of finding the right elements to get this Las Vegas Raiders squad back to relevancy. And Brock Bowers was a great start, but now you have to start looking ahead. Now you start having to build a championship pedigree again. And Brock Bowers is going to be a huge part of that. But right now, he's not in a position where he can beat these 2 guys and what they've done, because both of these guys are potential playoff hopefuls. And so that's why I feel like Brock Bowers is 3 on this list compared to these other 2. And then at the number 2 position is one of those guys, Bo Nix, who a lot of people would never have said would be in this position at the start of the season to now. But Bo Nix, whatever happened potentially after the bye to now, has been one of the most special players, but special rookies as well, at the quarterback position. I feel like, another reason why his status has skyrocketed in this race is because Sean Payton's offense, mind you, is very difficult to learn. It's not for everybody, like what we saw with his failure with Russell Wilson. It's a very specific, structured offense. But Bo Nix has been able to make his own because, unlike Russ in Denver, I feel like he really wants to bring out his dual threat abilities to help this offense. And because of that, it opens up a lot more for this team. It may not be the most talented team offensively on paper, but guys like Mims, guys like Vele, guys like Williams have all elevated their status because of the elevation of Bo Nix's game. And Bo Nix is someone who now has the attention of not just his team, but the league for what he can be in the Sean Payton offense. And if Sean Payton continues to rely on him in more ways than he did with Russ, then look out, because this could just be the start of a very special career for Bo Nix in Denver and a very special partnership between him and Sean Payton. And I don't often say this about quarterback because Sean Payton very rarely finds a hidden gem like a Drew Brees in his career. It's very difficult to give yourself over to a guy like Sean Payton, but Bo Nix has done that incredibly well his rookie season. So he deservedly sits in the number 2 spot, but I do think that when we look at this number 1 guy, there's just something a little bit more electrifying about picking Jaden Daniels over him. At minus 250, Jaden Daniels remains the favorite. He is getting challenged a little bit, but the difference between him and Nix is that Nix, yes, has looked like the better of the two over these past couple of weeks. But the way Jaden Daniels went about his prolific start to the season was unheard of. And I know that a lot of people are going to say, well, he's going to fade a lot more in the stretch because Cliff Kingsbury offenses never last. They're 8-5. And not for nothing, Cliff Kingsbury is still a very talented guy for diagnosing the best of what Jaden Daniels can do. And yes, it may not work against elite opponents, but I do feel like Jaden Daniels loves this style of football, and when he's playing it well, he's playing it better than any rookie could. And I know that it's a little bit too college style like for people's liking, but it works for him, and it has worked consistently for the Washington Commanders to this point. We're going to have to see how he looks down the stretch after this bye, but I do feel like Jaden Daniels right now is still the prospective favorite for the reward. As much as I respect what Bo Nix has done these past couple of weeks, I can't ignore what Jaden Daniels has done in Washington so efficiently as well, and so electrifying in certain moments that I can't necessarily deny him. Let me know what you think about this award race in the comments section, because it's a good one. It can get pretty heated down the stretch here, but coming up next, we conclude potentially my final ever weekly Shadow Report with the key wide receiver cornerback matchups to look out for in your first fantasy playoff matchup. I'll be right back after this short break to talk about it. Hello everyone, welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast for our final segment of today's show, and potentially the final edition of this segment, at least from a regular season perspective. It's my weekly Shadow Report. The key wide receiver cornerback matchups will define the fantasy football week, and this potentially your first fantasy playoff matchup as well. And it'll be sad to see this segment go, should I decide to eschew it for these last couple of fantasy playoff matchups. But for what it was, I truly hope it helped you really analyze decisions in terms of who could be standout from a wide receiver perspective and who would have a tough matchup week in and week out. And I truly appreciate all your comments on it as well, because it's a very special segment near and dear to my heart ever since its inception. So I appreciate all of you liking this one as much as you have. Without further ado, let's potentially get into the final time I'll ever do it again. Starting off with a wide receiver cornerback matchup that kind of can go a little bit under the radar and might not be on a lot of people's minds from a playoff perspective, but still an interesting one that I want to analyze. Amari Cooper going up against Carlton Davis in this one. And the reason why I like this one a lot is because from a Bills standpoint, they might want to start getting Amari Cooper involved more in this offense. Because if he is, then they become a lot more scary offensively, even after one of their scariest offensive performances against Los Angeles. Because if Amari Cooper gets going, then a lot more things are available to Josh Allen in this offense, even more than we already think. Because if you have a guy like Amari Cooper, who perhaps when he's on the field and healthy is your best route runner if you're the Bills, then you have a very physical tight end in Dalton Kincaid, who can be used in so many different areas of the field, but especially in short to intermediate areas as well. One of the best wheel route runners of any tight end in the league. Then you add in a physical back in James Cook, who I really love, and did very well for me in my personal fantasy football team. Then add in a guy like Khalil Shakir, who's very shifty in terms of picking up the ball in short areas of the field and getting downfield with his elite speed. This is one of the most dangerous offenses. And in this potential Super Bowl preview against the Lions, you're going to want to try and integrate Amari Cooper into this offense as much as possible, because if this truly is going to be the Super Bowl matchup that we get, then Amari Cooper's going to have to play a big role in both of them. Because if he does, then the Bills can keep pace with this Lions offense. If not, then hopefully, the Bills can keep up without him like they proved against different teams. But ultimately, this could be a huge X factor for the Chiefs on the stretch, and someone you might want to monitor in this Bills offense, even if he's not in your fantasy playoff roster for next season as well. And this matchup especially against perhaps what remains of this Lions secondary, their best player, Carlton Davis, I feel like that could be an interesting matchup if they go up against each other enough to warrant it. But ultimately, it's going to come down to Josh Allen's trust in him down the stretch. Then the next matchup, one that I believe we've seen already, I'm not sure in this kind of setting, Mike Evans taking on Cam Hart. Bucs Chargers, one of the most underrated games of this weekend slate. And it comes down to this Bucs offense attacking this Chargers defense with their downfield weapons. And I feel like, the way the Chargers can win this matchup is by keying in on Mike Evans, because it forces Baker to really try and get certain players a little bit more involved. And I feel like he can in certain moments. We saw Jalen McMillan last week get 2 receiving touchdowns, and we know what he can be in short yardage situations. But I do feel like Mike Evans is going to be the big X factor here. Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans' connection over these past 2 years cannot go ignored. It has been one of the best in the National Football League. And so, if the Chargers, with this young secondary, mind you, relying on these two guys, Hart and Still, in their secondary to hold up for them and try and get this pass rush home, if they can hold up, then chances are this is going to be a defensive slugfest, because I feel like Baker can carry this team on his back if he need be. But if he comes too over-reliant on Mike Evans in certain situations, especially in this vital matchup, then it could get a little bit testy for the Bucs on the offensive side of the football. But it all comes down to how much this defense and Jesse Minter relies on these two guys going up against this very special receiver here. Because a lot of people, from a fantasy perspective, are going to be relying on Mike Evans in this matchup. But these two young safeties have been very special for this, Chargers defense. But I do feel like Mike Evans can be a huge difference maker in this one if he can carry the load that's expected of him in this one as well. So this one's going to be another big matchup for Mike Evans. And the third one I want to discuss as well. Another interesting matchup here. Another experienced receiver going up against a young corner. Terry McLaurin taking on Kool-Aid McKinstry in this matchup. Commanders Saints. I feel like, Kool-Aid McKinstry has kind of gone under the radar when we talk about defensive rookies as someone who has kind of been too isolated in certain moments to really gauge what he can be for the Saints defense. But in this matchup against Terry McLaurin, I do feel like he has the instincts to slow down his downfield threat ability. Because I feel like in this matchup for the Commanders, coming off the bye, they're going to want to get back to keeping Jayden Daniels efficient, potentially allowing him to ramp it up to being able to throw those downfield passes. But for the most part, I don't expect Jayden Daniels to force things in this one. So that's one reason as to why this matchup might not be as prolific for fantasy owners of Terry McLaurin as they would expect. But I also feel like if those opportunities are available to both McDaniels and McLaurin, I feel like Kool-Aid McKinstry is one of those corners who thrives in players willing to go downfield on him. If it comes down to route running, I'm a little bit scared because I don't necessarily think the Saints have enough back-end coverage to compensate for any deficiencies at one specific pitch areas of the field. Sorry, mixing my footballs up. But Terry McLaurin is someone who I feel like is going to depend a lot on those one-on-one opportunities when they're available to him. And I feel like that gives the advantage a little bit to Kool-Aid McKinstry in terms of what he can do in terms of trying to slow him down. Because granted, like I said, the Saints are not a defense well equipped to help a rookie corner in certain situations. So it's going to be mano-a-mano, Terry versus him. And so that's why I feel like in those moments, he's going to have to come alive for the Saints defense. And I really think he can because we're underrating him a little bit because of the fact he's held down and hindered by the Saints defense. So I feel like this is going to be a put some respect on McKinstry's name kind of matchup. But I still feel like there will be moments where, of course, Terry McLaurin's prevalence will be felt. And then last but not least, the potential final Shadow Report matchup that I'll be looking into is completely different from these other two. While these other two were experience versus youth, this is youth versus youth. A rookie going up with a second-year player in a matchup that I feel like won't be as definitive as some others because the other two matchups you can say that the wide receivers have a specific advantage over their counterparts on the defensive end. This one is definitely going to be an intriguing one because the wide receiver has struggled in recent weeks, while this potentially all-pro season for the cornerback coming back from injury. And so Marvin Harrison Jr. versus Christian Gonzalez is going to be a very intriguing first-time battle. And I feel like, both of these teams really rely on these young talents. I feel like the Patriots more so than the Cardinals because the Cardinals do have McBride in the middle of the field who can exploit a lot of softer coverages, which I expect the Patriots to really come out with. But I do feel at the end of the day that Marvin Harrison Jr. can make life difficult for Christian Gonzalez in this one. And this is another matchup that, again, might not mean much from a fantasy playoff perspective. You might not even have this guy in your fantasy playoff roster. But for the long-term future of his fantasy career, this can be an important matchup because the Cardinals want to get back on track, right? They want to dominate a team like the Patriots. They want to prove they can stay in the thick of the NFC West. And Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to have to play a big part in that because if he's quiet, then I do feel like Kyler Murray becomes very limited. And I know they've had their trials and tribulations this season in terms of Marvin Harrison's feelings about their rapport and Kyler Murray's subsequent feelings as well. But ultimately, when they've been at their best, they've really, really shined in the downfield parts of their passing attack. But ultimately, the reason why I want to give credit to Christian Gonzalez is because he's a special corner for what he does for this team. Because if he locks down your top receiver, there's a chance that the Patriots can truly do what they really want on the defensive side of the football. Because they are, more often than not, a weaker defense than we realize, but they do have enough talent to really challenge certain players. And so if Christian Gonzalez locks down Marvin Harrison, that's one aspect of the Cardinals' offense, and a big one at that you're taking away. Now you just have to worry about McBride, Murray, and Connor, because those are the guys that I really think can hurt this Patriots defense. But I am giving Marvin Harrison a chance to prove himself in this situation, because he really has the ability to press Christian Gonzalez downfield. It's just a matter of getting it right, and ultimately Kyler Murray's reliance on him in this matchup. Let me know what you think about all these matchups. This could be the final Shadow Report I ever do, and I appreciate any subsequent comments you have about it. But this will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. We'll be back as always tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you feel so inclined, and also continue making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. But other than that, see you tomorrow. I am out for today.